All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first Galatians class on Zoom. If you're interested in joining us live on Zoom, you can click in the link below and go to my website and find the Zoom link there. And you'll get to see Chuck's fancy fish background that he's been playing with. So you got to come and join us and see Chuck underwater on Zoom. On YouTube, you're only going to get to see me because I don't want to be videoed people to the world who don't want to be videoed. So on YouTube, it'll just be me for now. A couple of housekeeping things before we get started. Next week, I'll be going to uh, to New York to Michael Miano's congregation to be giving a couple of lectures there on evangelism, and that'll be on October the 8th through the 11th. And I will be back here on YouTube for the Galatians class on Thursday at 6:30 Eastern, 5:30 Central on October the 14th. So you have 2 weeks to plan ahead, join us on Zoom, and that way you can talk to us live in the Zoom call, read passages as we get to them, ask questions, and things like that. So tonight what we're going to do, just to kind of give everybody a chance to get settled, to get their technology figured out and everything, is give an introduction to the book of Galatians. So the book of Galatians is one of Paul's most just direct, to the point, cuts right to the jugular kind of books. I mean, he really, from the very beginning, gets after them and really tries to bring home his point that he's going to make throughout the entire book, and we'll get into that here in a little bit. The book of Galatians was, well, when you ask when it was written, that's one of those questions where you ask 5 different preachers and you get 10 different answers, because we don't know when it was written. There are some books of the Bible, they'll say things like, in the year that so-and-so died, or 12 years ago this happened, or something like that. But the book of Galatians doesn't give us any specific kind of information like that. Now, it does give us some hints. It kind of gives us a window of when it could have been written. But at the end of the day, the exact date as to when it was written can't be known, but it also doesn't really matter. The book of Revelation, or any book of prophecy, for instance, it does matter what date you put on that book, because depending on how you set the date on it, it'll kind of change the information that's in there. For example, the book of Revelation talks about these series of emperors, and how you identify the emperor is kind of dependent upon how you date the book. And with all the imagery and symbology found in the book of Revelation, it's critical that you know when the book was written. Obviously, if the book was written at the end of the 90s, and it's a prophetic book looking forward, you wouldn't expect anything to be in there about things that happened in the past, right? That's typically how we view the book of Revelation. Well, the book of Galatians isn't like that. We have about a 10-year window and when it was written, and there's no real way to be sure. People of all different backgrounds and scholarship and whatever have very solid opinions on when this book was written, and these guys and gals are top of the line scholars, and so even they have disagreements. Basically, there's a couple of ideas. The book was written sometime between 47-ish and 57-ish, so in that kind of 10-year window. And the way people figure that stuff out, by the way, just if you're curious, is they go read the book of Acts. And the book of Acts talks about the Apostle Paul. And the Apostle Paul had all these missionary journeys that he went on. And what they try to do is they try to read Galatians and look for any clues as to what happened, maybe on those missionary journeys that kind of clue you in as to when the book took place. For example, Galatians chapter 2 talks about the Apostle Paul going to Jerusalem to meet with the apostles there to talk about whether or not this guy named Titus, who was a Gentile, needed to be circumcised. And that happened, as far as we can tell, in Acts chapter 15. The thing about that is, though, is that not everybody agrees that that's what it's talking about in Galatians 2. So even there's a little bit of confusion. Or for example, in Galatians chapter 1, he says in verse 6 I am amazed that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel. So if these individuals were already kind of leaving Jesus behind quickly, then it doesn't make sense for it to be written too far away from whenever Paul first made converts in Galatia. Does that kind of make sense? Um, if the dentist looks at your teeth, 1 month, and then 6 months later he says, "Man, these things decayed quickly." It's he's telling you you must not have been doing what you're supposed to do and floss like I told you because these things got bad fast, and that's what happened to the church at Galatia. Let me see here. Another passage that people kind of bring up is Galatians chapter 4 and verse 13. He says there, you know that it was because of a bodily illness that I preached the gospel to you the first time. So people try to look at the book of Acts and they say, okay, where was Paul sick? When was he going through some kind of illness, or he had to slow down and stop or whatever. And then finally in verse 16 he says, so have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? That's Galatians 4:16. So apparently when Paul stopped to see him, he made a bunch of people mad, and so people try to use that to calculate when the book was written. What I'm trying to show you is there's a lot of information in the book about when the book was written, what circumstances it was written in, whatever. And we can make good guesses, but we can't nail it down because he simply doesn't tell us. One other thing along those same lines that I'll bring up, and all this, you can go get any book, any commentary on the book of Galatians, and you can read the introduction, and it's going to go through all this stuff in way more detail than what we're going to do now, because I don't see it as that important, but it's good for you to be aware of. There were two different regions of Galatia that Paul went to, the north and the south. And depending on who you think this book was written to, those in the north or those in the south, also changes the date. So there's some cultural terms and some ethnical terms that are used in Galatians that kind of hint at maybe he was writing to the north, maybe he was writing to the south. And again, all kinds of great people are divided over that, and so there's no reason for us to spend too much time talking about that when at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter all that much. All right, let's have a little discussion real quick about, it's kind of about what we just talked about, but it's a little bit more involved. Let's say that you're a little kid. I did this when I was little, and you go to your grandparents' house, and they put you in the guest room, and if your grandparents' house was like mine was, then they probably had some kind of chest or some kind of closet with a whole bunch of stuff in there that they collected over the years. Or maybe you had an aunt or somebody, or you're cleaning out a house for somebody and you came across that. And let's say that as you're going through this closet, you come across a big stack of newspapers. So you pick one up. What's the first thing that you look for? And y'all are all muted, so you might need to unmute. What do you look for in a newspaper if you find it and you're trying to read it? The date? The date, that's right. What else do you look for? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So you look at the date, you look at the pictures. Maybe if it's a black and white picture, that might tell you, a little bit. And if it was a color picture, that might tell you something else, right? Um, Maybe the picture might tell you the geographical location, right? What else might you look for at a newspaper besides the date, besides the pictures? Yeah, that's right. Who's doing the writing and who they're writing to. So what might be at the very top of the page all the way across to clue you in as to what newspaper this even is? Yeah, exactly. The title of the newspaper. Because if you think about it, how many cities do you know of have two competing newspapers that talk about politics or sports from completely different angles? You got your Florida State newspaper, and Florida State, it's always on the front. And then you got the Florida Gators newspaper, right? Where, they're the ones that kind of root for Florida Gators a little bit more. So you can kind of see the bias. So knowing what newspaper you're dealing with can clue you in onto, you know, um, can clue you in onto, what you might be getting into whenever you read, right? And I just realized that nobody can hear y'all, so I'm glad we're doing this in a. I'm glad we're doing this in a sort of a test run here. But anyways, there we go. So yeah, so those are some of the basic things that you look for in the newspaper. You also want to look for the region, don't you? Because the region can also determine, right? Hey, yeah, exactly. All of that is relevant because if it's written in Spanish, one, you might not be able to read it, right? You probably have to go find a translator. And then, what'd you say, Chuck? Yeah. Yep. Exactly. Exactly. I don't think I'm gonna have to play with this because I don't know if I can capture audio like that. I'll figure this out by next week. Don't worry about it. So people won't be able to hear y'all too much, but I'm kind of repeating what you're saying anyways, so it's okay. Yeah. So the language. So you have to find a translator. Now, is every translator of the same quality? They're not, are they? Yeah, exactly. Because sometimes translation can be opinion, right? You got a word, it can kind of go either way, and maybe the person isn't as intelligent or whatever. You have to really, you have to really test out that translator, don't you? And these are all things that we have to do when we're studying the Bible. Sometimes we look at the Bible as it's a book in its own special category, which it is because it's the Word of God. But we use the same tools that we use to read the Bible as we do other books, and vice versa. So those are the same kind of questions that we're kind of asking in this introduction. What date was it written? Who is it written to? Who wrote the book? What's the situation of the book? And when you got a newspaper, you can do that, can't you? I mean, you can go to Wikipedia or whatever and type this day in history, and it'll pull up all the articles, that mention that specific date, right? And so you go to January 6th, and it's going to say, oh, January 6th, that's when Daniel was born. You should buy him a present, right? You go, oh, thanks Wikipedia, appreciate that. Yeah, that's right. Peanut butter chocolate. Let's see. Oh, where are they? I think I've got. Oh, they're on the other. They must be on the other side of the desk. I've got a pack of them over there in celebration of yesterday's holy day. I don't know if y'all know about that. It was a joke. It was a joke I put on Facebook, but um, yeah, Reese's peanut butter cup. Give your minister Reese's peanut butter cup day. It's one of the most. Do I? Yeah, remember next year. You can send me $3 in PayPal. I'll pick one up from the Winn Dixie. But what'd you say, Chuck? Yeah, yeah. Send me that $3 check and I'll go get a pack. Um, but yeah, so these are the same questions we have to ask when we're getting into the Bible, and a lot of people study the Bible this way. I need to defend whatever belief I've got, right? Whether it's about prophecy, whether it's about uh, how we worship or baptism or whatever. What people do is they go to a concordance, they look up the passage, they open up their Bible and they go, oh, yep, okay, oh, there's one verse. That verse gives me everything I need to know, and they shut their Bible and they look up another verse. They go there. Oh, there we go. That's another one, and they never take the time to ask those critical questions. Who wrote this book? Why did they write it? Why is he even talking about that subject? What does it have to do with? You see, and so we have to use our brains when we're going to the scripture. We can't just go to it to try to find what we already believe. We should go to it to be challenged, to learn something, to mature, because this book here can always offer us something, uh, some new piece of information, some new nourishment that we didn't have before. But if we're just going to it to get what we already believe, well, it's not going to be able to do any of that for us. Yes, ma'am. Go for it, Karen. That's right. That's right, Karen. What Karen says, for those of you who might not be able to hear, is that a lot of people read the Bible as if it was written to them instead of for them. You wouldn't pick up a letter between George Washington and his wife and think that that was written to you. A good example of this, and one that I use a lot, is in World War II, they had this expression when they talked about a soldier that died that he bought the farm because his life insurance policy paid off the family farm. And so instead of saying Uncle Jack died, they say, well, he bought the farm. But if I were to write a letter and say, hey, old Bob there bought the farm, you would think, oh, he did? Does he have cows? Can I come see him? You wouldn't be thinking that he passed away in World War II, obviously, right? But just like reading the Bible, which is in many cases a collection of letters, depending on what book you're looking at, you have to use the same skills that you would in picking up a letter. Laura likes to get letters from the antique store, or from a thrift store. She'll find a bundle of letters, and they're selling them for like $1. And she found this one bunch that was a series of love letters that they had met through some newspaper matchmaking, kind of deal. And she read all their love letters that their family members had for some reason gotten rid of. And that's what you have to do when you read those letters. You look at the dates, you look at the setting, where were they living, what were they doing, and then you know what you have to do? And this is true about the book of Galatians to some extent as well, is there are references that they're going to make in these books of the Bible that you can't get from just reading the Bible. You have to look up the background. Now, that's not saying that you need this to have faith in God, or you need this extra information to know Jesus and know God and to live a moral life or whatever. But all I'm saying is that sometimes when you're reading the Bible, there's historical information that we don't have access to if we haven't taken the time to learn and to discover what that is. Because remember, this book wasn't written in a vacuum. These people had lives and careers and family and friends and traditions and religious traditions. If those that came from the idolatrous background, and even those that came from a Jewish background, they had the traditions that were passed down to them. And sometimes it takes a little bit of research to really get into some of these passages that have those kind of references in them. One good book that you might look into getting into, you can get it electronically or whatever, is the IVP Biblical Background Commentary by Craig S. Keener. And this is a New Testament commentary. There's an Old Testament version as well. And you look here, like you go to the book of Galatians in it, and he doesn't have comments on every verse, but as you're reading through there, he'll give you some historical information, maybe some references that Paul is making in there about cities and people and places that you wouldn't know just from reading the name of the city. And so books like that can really help you, more so than just a regular commentary can, because it gives you the idea of the social situation, the life situation of the people. Okay, does anybody have any comments about any of that before we continue on? All right, let's keep moving then. So what's the book of Galatians about? All right, so the book of Galatians is, it really has two primary purposes. The first purpose is to defend Paul's apostleship. There were some people who were saying that he was kind of a fake apostle, he was a fraud, he was just in it for the money or whatever, and he wasn't in it to really try to serve God. And so a lot of Galatians, especially towards the beginning and towards the end, make some comments about Paul's apostleship. The other major point of Galatians is to answer this question about the Gentiles' relationship to the law, right? Because the Gentiles, they weren't raised under the Old Covenant law. They weren't raised with the things like circumcision and Sabbath and the feast days and sacrifices and all that kind of stuff. And so how can they become part of what Paul calls the commonwealth of Israel and not follow those rules? That's a question that a lot of people had during that day. And so Paul's other major, and probably the major point of writing Galatians, is to get at that teaching that was going on, that the gospel of Jesus wasn't enough. They also had to have this other. They also had to have circumcision and the feast days and the law and things like that. Galatians is really broken up into three sections if you want to write these down. And you can kind of see these section breaks as you read through the book yourself. Galatians chapters 1 through 2, Galatians 1 and 2, is Paul's apologetic. It's his defense. He gives the history of his conversion. He gives the history of his calling to be an apostle, and he even gets into the situation that caused him to write this letter. That caused him to get to reach out to the Galatians and warn them about what was going on, and really get on to them in many cases for starting to believe some of these teachings that were going on concerning the law. So that's Galatians 1 and 2. That's his apologetic. Galatians chapter 3 through chapter 5 verse 12 is his attack, his polemic, his written attack at why these teachings were wrong, why having the Gentile believers to be circumcised goes against everything that Jesus died for, right? So that's really what he focuses on in chapter 3 through chapter 5 and verse 12. And then finally, in chapter 5 and verse 13, all the way to the end of the book, which would be chapter 6 and verse 18, that's Paul just encouraging the church like he typically does. Paul usually takes, a couple chapters or so towards the end of all of his epistles to just take a step back and encourage. And, old Billy Bob said hi, Peggy Sue, she said hi as well, and you go tell Cletus that we really miss him and that we'll come see him one day, right? That's kind of what Paul does at the end of a lot of his letters. He gives some encouragement. So that's the basic outline of Galatians. Very, very simple, not complicated at all. And so what you have in Galatians are some pretty interesting things. Chapters 1 and 2, I said, mainly historical, mainly just his kind of introduction into what's going on and why his apostleship is from God. And in chapters 3 and 4, he talks about Abraham and the law, and Abraham and faith. At the end of chapter 4, he even gives this major, what you would call an allegorical interpretation of Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael and Hagar in Galatians 4:21 to 31. And this allegorical way of interpreting the Bible, as we're going to get to in several weeks, is a pretty typical way that the rabbis would interpret Scripture. And Paul, the one who authored this book, was trained at the feet of the best rabbi around during that time, whose name was Gamaliel. And so Paul he's trained in all things pertaining to the law. And he even considered himself, as we're going to see on the 14th of October, he considered himself perfect when it came to the law. If there was a law or rule or ordinance or tradition, he did it to the T. And he talks about that in Philippians chapter 3. And yet, at the same time, despite saying all that about how good of a Jew he was and how good of a rabbi he was, Pharisee he was, he says in 1 Timothy chapter 1 that he was the chief of all sinners. See, there's a difference between being religious and doing all the correct ordinances that people want you to do and all the things like that, going to church on Sunday, whatever, and following God. Anybody can go through the motions, but following God means a transformation of your life. And what Paul was doing really was serving himself, as he gets into. He talks about in Philippians chapter 3 that he was really serving his own righteousness, not God's righteousness. And this is probably why he was so combative in the book of Galatians, because he's dealing with people who are acting just like he acted about, either, depending on how you look at it, 10 or 20 years before when he was first converted in the years following Jesus' crucifixion. Because Paul, remember, was persecuting the church. He had Stephen killed. He was going to throw people in jail. And he was doing that because of his dedication to the law. And so Paul sees where this could potentially go and where it had already gone in his own life. And he's putting his foot down and he's going to stop it. In Galatians chapter 1, if somebody could, since I don't have the audio fix on this, let me read it. And then y'all can start reading on the 14th when we have the audio fix. In Galatians 1, verse 13 and 14, Paul says this: For you have heard of my former way of life in Judaism, how I used to persecute the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my countrymen, being more extremely zealous for my ancestral traditions. So, what Paul's telling you there in Galatians chapter 1 is, hey, these guys aren't doing anything that I didn't do. I mean, they're acting exactly like I acted. They had the same attitude, the same philosophy. And guess what? When I was doing it, I was probably doing it better than they're doing it now, right? And so that's where he's coming from. He is so offended by what's going on because this is how he used to be before he met Jesus. And maybe that's why maybe some of the Christians maybe some of the pastors or ministers that do get so offended by sin is because they lived in it. That was them. And it reminds them of how they used to be, and so that's why they get so especially touchy when it comes to stuff like that. Maybe you have something that you used to do and that you kind of lash out at a little bit more than the other things because that was your big fault, and you almost kind of blame yourself even still for that, even though you've been forgiven. And this is what kind of Paul's doing in Galatians 1. He's saying these guys think these guys think that they're following ancestral traditions. These guys think that they're being zealous. I was, and I persecuted the church, but I'm not in that now, and I don't want you to confuse me with them. It's kind of his point. I had an idea of going and reading some passages in the book of Acts, but maybe I'll do that for y'all. Give that to y'all for almost a sort of a homework assignment of sorts, because it's a pretty lengthy reading, and I think that doing it would be good for you. And since we don't have the audio, I would really like to read that together. And so I'll have you do it, and then we'll read it again together the next time that we meet. This is Acts chapter 15. Really, Acts chapter 15, verses 1 through 35. But there's only 6 more verses, so you might as well just read those too. It's not going to hurt you. So Acts chapter 15, verses 1 through 35. And then to get an idea of what Paul was having to deal with, you might also read 2 extra passages. These aren't, required like Acts 15 kind of is, but you might also look at Acts chapter 17, 1 through 15, Acts 17, 1 through 15. And if you're feeling really, really zealous, really studious that day, you might go read Acts chapter 21 and verse 15 all the way down through verse 40. Acts chapter 21, verses 15 through verse 40. And, really try to read Acts 15. If you can't read the other 2, I understand, but does anybody need me to repeat those at all? Or did y'all hear them okay? All right, good. Starting on the 14th, when we get to the verse-by-verse study, I'm going to be writing an article or essay or whatever for each lesson that we do. And so if you'd like to, you can keep up with that on your computer. You can download them or whatever. You can even get a notebook and print them out if you want to, put them in a binder or something. But I'm going to be writing those essays for you as we go through the book of Galatians to kind of give you some supplementary material. We're not going to use them in the class. The class is going to be more discussion-based and extemporaneous, but you can use that as extra material to kind of supplement what we're doing in the class, okay? And I'll probably include, quotations from different scholars and things like that we're not really going to care about in the class and on YouTube, all right? All right, well, does anybody have any questions or things like that before we go? One other thing actually. The 14th, we'll go for an hour. We'll go from 5:30 to 6:30, or from 6:30 to 7:30. But every other week, we're going to only be able to go for 30 minutes. So it's going to be an hour, 30 minutes, hour. So, you can kind of plan stuff around that. If somebody wants to go out to eat, you can say, yeah, we can go out on Thursday, but only every other week and after 6 o'clock or after 7 o'clock, right? So you can plan accordingly around that. And that way, you don't miss a class. But if you do, it's on YouTube, so you better catch up there. All right. That should be it. Yes, ma'am? What you got? Oh, okay. Oh wow. So you actually met somebody that said that Paul wasn't an apostle. That's odd. I wonder if he has a Bible that only has, Matthew through Acts and then, James through Revelation, That's kind of odd. It's funny because I've not really heard of anybody. Um, I've heard people say that Paul was the only apostle for us, and we only had to read his stuff. But I haven't heard anybody say that about Paul not being an apostle. That's kind of what the book of Galatians is all about. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the background is. You'd have to ask him because I've never honestly heard of that before. So I'm not. I'm just not sure. Um, but the internet is a big place, and there's all kinds of teaching on there. Anybody can just do what I'm doing: start a Zoom channel, press record, and start talking. So you know, there's no end to what's out there online. so, but that is kind of disturbing that somebody thinks like that. I've heard people say that some of the books of Paul weren't inspired. Some of the more what you'd call liberal scholars believe that about First Timothy, Second Timothy, Titus, but not Galatians. In fact, in one of the books that I was reading in preparation for this class, he said that if any of the epistles, which he believed they all were, but if any of them were written by Paul, it's Galatians, because it is just the most authentic in terms of the manuscripts and the historical data and historical references. Galatians is like the most verified book of Paul that we got. Right now, he not he did yeah, and Paul sometimes would take a step back and he'd say, now what I'm saying is for me, it's not for the Lord. But in other cases, he would say, the commands we give you are the commands of the Lord. So I just don't know how you'd get away with that. Um, but like I said, there's a lot of strange beliefs out there, and so we just have to you know figure out how to deal with them as we come across them. But what I'll do for the next time we get together is I'm going to look into why my audio for y'all isn't working on the YouTube. And then we will be able to read the verses and things like that, like I planned. But y'all go ahead and read those passages I mentioned, and I'll see y'all on YouTube on October the 14th.